So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker this morning. Responsible for developing and leading successful recoveries for reptiles, mammals, and birds, including the pink pigeon, echo parakeet, and most famously, as Mike said, the Mauritius kestrel. Carl Jones brought the total population of the rarest bird on the planet from only 4 individuals to nearly over 400 over the course of a decade. Carl's vision and action and determination prove that changing the future for threatened species is possible. For his unyielding efforts and momentous conservation achievements, he was awarded the 2016 Indianapolis Prize. Please welcome to the stage Scientific Director of the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, Dr. Carl Jones.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be among so many zoo professionals. When I was a young lad, I had one dream in life, and that was to have my own zoo, much like many of you. And when I was 4 years old, I said to myself, one day I'm going to have a zoo with every species of animal in the world. And of course, as a 4-year-old, that was quite achievable, because I didn't know many species. And as I grew older, I became quite excited. I discovered a lot about all the wonderful creatures in this world, and I thought, wow, I'm going to have a great zoo. And then one day I woke up, and I realized I could never fulfill my dream. There are just too many animals in the world. And that disappointment has stayed with me all my life, because I've realized that zoos are very important. We can save lots of endangered species, but unfortunately, within our zoos, we cannot save them all. But zoos do have the answer. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I believe zoos can help save all the world's most endangered species. I'm a conservation biologist. I spend some of my time teaching in universities. And if you read conservation biology literature, they tell you about all the problems. They tell you how it's inevitable we're going to lose so many species. I think that's nonsense. I think we need to be more positive. We need to think about what we can achieve. And the zoo community has the answer for many of the conservation problems on this earth. I have to thank the AZA for inviting me, and also the Indianapolis Zoo. The people in the Indianapolis Zoo have become very great friends of mine, and last year I won the Indianapolis Prize. And what vision! Mike Crowther and Karen and the team who set up the Indianapolis Prize are showing us that we should be celebrating conservation success. Let's forget about the doom and gloom. Let's look at what we can achieve. So we really need to celebrate what we do and what we can achieve. My talk today is going to be called Lessons from the Dodo. The dodo was a bird that lived on the island of Mauritius. The last one was seen in 1662, and it was arguably the first species that became extinct when we realized that we'd caused its demise. Someone can argue that on the island of Mauritius, we had the dawning of modern conservation consciousness. Many other species have become extinct on Mauritius, but we've also been able to save them. And I think there's some very important lessons there. And what are we about in the zoo community? We're about preventing extinctions. And that's going to be the theme of what I'm going to be talking about today. I told you that I always wanted my own zoo. Unfortunately, it never happened. But I do have a small collection of animals that I keep in my backyard. And for me, it's very important, that relationship between me and the animals. As a conservation biologist, yes, we can look at animals in an objective way, in a scientific way, but there's nothing quite like being close to the animals that we work with. And I'm very fortunate that I breed Andean condors. But anyway, that's an aside. So I never had my own zoo, but I have a few animals. But I'm very fortunate that I work for a wonderful zoo, a zoo set up by the author and naturalist Gerald Durrell. Jerry was a visionary. He believed that zoos were very, very important conservation institutions. He believed that zoos had the answer to saving endangered species. And he set up the Jersey Zoo to breed and look after critically endangered species. And he was one of the people who developed the whole paradigm of zoos as conservation institutions. And he chose the dodo as the symbol of our trust because he wanted to ensure there'd be no more dodos. And we only have to look at some of the historical tragedies that have happened in the last century or so. Some of these species could have been saved by enlightened captive breeding. And it is regrettable that we are still losing species. But I hope that in the future, we will be able to prevent similar disasters. Jerry was really moved and motivated by the loss of species. So much so that the Jersey Zoo sponsored the first conference on endangered species management, showing how zoos could really help save critically endangered species. And if you read this book, it's full of optimism that we can save species by captive breeding. And then a few years later, Jerry wrote The Sinking Ark, which I think is one of his best books. And he talked about zoos as arks, where the main focus should be conservation and research, captive breeding and reintroduction. But Jerry took the zoo paradigm further. And he said when we work with endangered species, we should also be working with those species in the wild. And we should develop the capacity in those countries for people to look after the endangered animals. And this has been the theme of Jersey Zoo for many years, working with endangered species, working them in countries of origin, and training people to look after their own resources. And of course, we all know that we've been successful in preventing the extinction of many species. These are just a few of the ones. And you'll notice there are a number there from North America. There are also some very important lessons. We can't save all the species in zoos. And if you look at those successes, most of them were done by zoos working within the range of those endangered species. So there are 3 species there from North America, and one from Hawaii as well, and a number from Europe and the Middle East. And zoos work very well when they're working with the species from their own country. I mentioned there is a limit to the extent we can manage species in captivity. Bill Conway told us a number of years ago, there are just too many species and not enough room. So we have to be selective. Yes, we can do a great job with the species we work with, but what about all the others? And the geneticists tell us that you get selection in captivity, and that if you keep species in captivity for a large number of generations, you're actually starting to domesticate those species. So the original idea that Jerry Durrell and the zoo community had, that zoos are arks, is actually flawed. And today, I want to examine how we can actually modify that approach and take the thinking that evolved in the 1970s and developed that further. I think the zoo community has done a great deal, but I think we're very complacent. We should be doing more. We're very self-congratulatory, when actually we should be challenging what we do. Look at what works. Look at what we can do better. To think outside the cages and to actually be more creative in our approaches to animal management. Then we'll be able to make a real difference. There needs to be greater integration between the work in captivity and the wild. And the geneticists tell us fluid movement of species between wild and captivity. These are some of the approaches that we need to be developing. And I'm going to talk about the story of some of the species that I've been working with. I've worked on the island of Mauritius. I've worked there for nearly 4 decades. It's a small island off the coast of Madagascar, off the east coast of Africa. And thank you very much. You told me about the work with the Mauritius kestrel. Wonderful introduction by Mike and Dan. The Mauritius kestrel was once the world's rarest bird. It declined in 1974 to just 4 individuals in the wild. And that has been confirmed or supported by genetic evidence. All the evidence suggests it went down to just 1 breeding pair. And when I started working with the kestrel in the 1970s, there was a lot of feeling that we should abandon the Mauritius kestrel. Norman Myers, a very important and influential conservation thinker, said we might abandon the Mauritius kestrel to its all but inevitable fate and utilize the funds to proffer stronger support for any of the hundreds of threatened bird species that are more likely to survive. He was saying, let's give up on critically endangered species and put the money into working with species that aren't such high risk. Fortunately, we don't agree with that. And I was very lucky that Jerry Durrell didn't believe in that, and neither did Tom Cade from the Peregrine Fund, who was one of the supporters of this work. And working with them and their colleagues, we were able to restore the Mauritius kestrel. We harvested eggs from wild nests to encourage double clutching, hand-reared the young to establish a captive breeding project. And over a decade, we reared and released 333 birds to the wild. And we supported them with nest boxes and, for a while, with supplemental feeding. Today, the population isn't as high as we'd like, but we have 350 to 400 birds, which is a lot better than extinction. The work with the kestrel encouraged us to work with other species. The pink pigeon declined to a tiny population in the 1990s, bred them in captivity, released a number to the wild, and we support them in the wild with supplemental feeding and predator control. We now have 400 birds flying around on Mauritius and hope to get that number up to 600 in the next decade. And that work encouraged us to move on to the echo parakeet, once the world's rarest parrot. It's related to the ringneck parakeet group. But when we started, there was only 1 or 2 breeding pairs, and they were inevitably failing. So we monitored all the nests, took failing chicks from the nest, hand-reared them in captivity, set up a captive breeding program, and were able to rear and release 139 birds, which we then supported in the wild. Survival of our released birds was about 90%, which of course is very high. But it was because we were looking after those birds really intensively. We've subsequently supported our released birds with supplemental feeding and provision of nest boxes, and we now have a growing population of nearly 700 birds, and it's not showing any sign of slowing down. And the really interesting point here is that the techniques used for the echo parakeet can be used for all the other endangered parrots in the world. There's a lot of transference of these skills. So this gives great hope for all the other endangered parrots out there. And what we have done has been to improve survival and productivity by mitigating limiting factors. Now, that's what you do in your zoos. You make sure your animals survive well, you make sure they breed. So what we're doing is applying zoo approaches to wild populations. We try and understand limiting factors. I don't expect you to know that person. It's David Lack, the most famous British ecologist, but Americans tend to forget about him. He was the one that came up with a coherent theory of population biology and what controls vertebrate populations. And we all say that he is the father of understanding how populations worked. However, I did a bit of research into his work, and I found out that he was standing on the shoulders of Aldo Leopold, your great American ecologist. So I think that David Lack was the father of population biology, but it was probably Aldo Leopold. But anyway, we'll forget about that. But what was really nice was that David Lack and his students demonstrated that populations were controlled by a small number of factors: food, predators, disease, and in some species, shortage of breeding sites. And that, you can apply that to virtually all vertebrates. And of course, if you can identify what the limiting factors are, you can solve them by supplemental feeding if there's a shortage of food, controlling predators, controlling disease, and creating breeding sites. And isn't that what we do in our zoos? We feed our animals, keep them safe, treat them if they're sick, and make sure they've got the conditions to breed. So we can manage wild populations by taking a lot of our thinking, applying it to species in the wild. So that has been our approach. And it's worked exceedingly well with the kestrel, the pigeon, and the parrot. And I showed you the types of things that we did: nest boxes, feeding, controlling predators, controlling disease, and so on. And this is what's happened to those three species. The kestrel is the top graph, the one in the middle is the pink pigeon, and the green one is the echo parakeet. The kestrel went up much higher than it is now because we were managing it very intensively in the early days, and we actually released more than the habitat could support. But nevertheless, you look at those graphs and you think, wow, it's worked. I showed these graphs to my bosses. I should mention they're not my bosses anymore, they've moved on, so this is a while ago. I showed them these graphs and I was very, very proud. And I said, look, this is what we've done in Mauritius with those three iconic species. And they looked and they shook their head and they said, Carl, why did it take you so long? And I thought, oh my God, what do you mean, why did it take me so long? They said, look, it's taken you decades to save these species. And of course, they're right. But you look at our successful programs here in North America. California Condor. Carl Corford started that work way back in the 1930s. Whooping crane. That goes back to the 1930s. The work on the black-footed ferret. Again, it takes decades. Yes, we can save species. It's not very difficult, but it does take time. And I think there's a very, very important lesson there. A lot of us sponsor conservation programs, and very often we give money for 3, 5, if we're lucky, 10 years. But you know, we should be thinking about conservation programs for decades. And in Mauritius, I've been telling all our staff and colleagues, we need to have a 100-year vision for all our species. Where do we want to go? Where do we want to be in 100 years' time? Not 3 or 5 years, that's nonsense. We've got to be thinking long-term. I mentioned those three species, the kestrel, the pigeon, and the parrot. We've actually applied similar techniques to a whole range of species. We have 5 species of birds that we've recovered from populations of 12 or less. But we've also got 9 species, 5 birds, 3 reptiles, and a fruit bat, that without conservation action, we would have most likely have lost and they would have become extinct. So these techniques work, not to mention the work that we've done on plants. There are certainly tens of species that we've actually saved. But if we actually look at the work that we've done on these birds, including a number of passerines as well, this is what happens, or what has happened to island birds worldwide. This is the Living Planet Index, which was put together by the Zoological Society of London. And this shows the population trends of birds worldwide. And this is our trend. Shows it works. And within the zoo, Jersey Zoo, within Durrell, we've been actually taking these approaches and applying them to species worldwide. To pygmy hogs in Assam, to the mountain chicken in Montserrat and Dominica. Yes, lots of challenges, but taking captive breeding techniques into the field work. And this is an index that we've put together, and we looked at 17 of our target species. 8 of them underwent improvement in red list category due to conservation. And we've seen overall, in terms of the index, a 67% increase in the value of the index between 1988 and 2012, which contrasts to the counterfactual where those populations would have declined without our efforts. So this is showing captive breeding works. Captive breeding works when you apply those techniques to wild populations. There's a very powerful message there. But there's an even more powerful message. And that is, when we work with individual species, it drives work on other species, but also in restoring whole systems. I teach conservation biology at several universities in Britain. And they always argue, oh, we shouldn't be working on species. We should be working on whole systems. That's where we should be putting the resources. And I tell them, that's nonsense. We're looking at it in the wrong way. Species work drives the restoration of whole systems. You start off with one species, you end up restoring the whole system. I have to thank many of you here in the audience for the support that you've given us in the Rodrigues fruit bat. Mike mentioned in his very generous introduction, and he said about how the Rodrigues fruit bat was down to about 100 individuals and we now have 10,000. Mike, you got that wrong. It went down to about 60, maybe 60 to 100. The population has increased so much. In fact, this graph is out of date. We now have 25,000 bats on Rodrigues. The Rodrigues warbler, which was thought extinct in the 1960s, we now have 20,000 individuals of those as well. And the Rodrigues fody, we have 15,000. These figures are out of date. But it's happened because we've had support from AZA members, from a number of zoos who keep Rodrigues fruit bats. And we have been restoring habitat in Rodrigues, doing lots of education, and the species are becoming back. The same thing has happened with work that we've done on reptiles. In the Jersey Zoo, we've been keeping round island reptiles in captivity for a number of years, and this encouraged us to work on trying to restore the island itself. This is what Round Island looks like. And when we started, it was denuded. It had rabbits and goats on it, and most of the soil had disappeared, and this was a typical view of the island. The island was dying. We needed to get rid of the rabbits and goats, and if you want to do that, you hire a group of Kiwis. I just love New Zealanders. They're some of the best field workers in the world, But all the ones I've known, you wouldn't take any of them to a cocktail party. They have no social skills whatsoever. But when it comes to killing things, they're wonderful. Anyway, I joke because the gentleman there on the right is Don Merton, who died a few years ago, who was without doubt one of my great mentors and a very dear friend. And in addition to learning how to restore islands, he restored the Chatham Island Black Robin. He was very proud because he'd restored it from 5. And I used to tell him, well, actually, I've done a bird from 4 dons. So anyway, that was a bit of one-upmanship. But he was also responsible for the restoration of the kakapo, the most remarkable of all parrots. Anyway, working with a group of New Zealanders, we were able to get rid of the rabbits. And you can see some of those photographs, the island coming back, the restoration of the plants. We also helped the island along by planting some nursery-grown plants as well. And with that, the reptiles started to come back. But unfortunately, tortoises were missing. They'd become extinct 2 centuries before, endemic tortoises from the island of Mauritius. And I said to my friends and some of my academic colleagues, let's get another species of tortoise and put them on the island to replace the one that's gone. And they said, don't be stupid. You can't do that. I said, let's use an exotic tortoise. And I argued that we needed tortoises to restore the vegetation, because tortoises have a very profound ecological role. They're keystone species. They're grazers and tramplers. They're important browsers. They're also important seed dispersers. So we needed an ecological replacement. It took me 20 years to convince people, but I eventually convinced my colleagues that we should put giant tortoises on Round Island, which we've done. We've used Aldabra giant tortoises. We didn't just chuck them on and forget about it. We did a proper PhD study and proper monitoring. And we found that the tortoises started to feed on the fallen fruits of ebony trees. And these ebony trees were not growing. They were not regenerating until we put tortoises there. And we found that the tortoises were eating the fruits, passing the seeds in their droppings, and all these beautiful little trees started to grow all over the island. And we did some experiments, taking the seeds and growing them in nurseries. And we compared those that had gone through the gut of our tortoise with those that we just collected on the ground. And we found that they did a lot better, giving us good empirical evidence to show that tortoises are very important seed dispersers. They're also very important for restoring the grazing climax community. And there's a whole series of plants, small herbaceous plants, that need to be trampled and grazed, and they grow in open areas. We've put back 516 giant tortoises on Round Island. We bred those on the mainland of Mauritius. And we're beginning to see them controlling exotic grasses and restoring native vegetation types. We are seeing plants coming back that previously were not regenerating. Critically endangered plants are being saved from extinction by the tortoises. This is a very controversial approach, but it works very well, finding ecological replacements. There's a very important lesson in this. That is that we can restore communities, but in the future, we will also be building novel communities. We're not about preservation, keeping things as they are. We can't do that. We're not about turning the clock back. But what we are about is looking to the future and thinking how we can preserve maximum biodiversity. Most conservationists want to turn the clock back. I think the zoo community are far more creative than that. And we want to think to the future and think, how are we going to save our species in a rapidly changing world? I'm a great optimist, and this is why I love the Indianapolis Prize. thrives on optimism. We can make a difference. But we've got to stop thinking that the answer is self-sustaining captive populations. Yes, that is an answer, but the answer is taking captive breeding into the wild and learning how to manage species and use those species to drive the restoration of whole ecosystems. I want to put other species of tortoises on Round Island. The browsing tortoise from Galapagos. I want to find a replacement flightless rail for the extinct one. And I want to bring back the Abbott's booby, which is now only found on Christmas Island off Australia. So we've got a vision, a 100-year vision for Round Island, and it's achievable. Restoring the biodiversity, but also in some ways recreating a novel system. This is showing the way forward. So, as a zoo community, we should be taking captive breeding into the field. And we should embrace the fact that species conservation drives the restoration of whole systems. And don't forget that. We're about species, their habitats, and building systems for our animals to live in. Conservation works. It may take decades to save species, and possibly centuries to restore ecosystems, but we can do it, and we should not tolerate any future extinctions. Thank you very much. Thank you.